Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 52 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, and today featured the 8th discussion roundtable session dedicated to issues around domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. And like other days and other discussions of this nature, there was no reference to the killer, Gabriel Whitman, his common law spouse of 19 years, Lisa Banfield, or any of the other specific factual elements of the events of the mass casualty of April 18, 19, 2020. We've come used to that now, that these expert discussions have really, they don't connect their expertise to the events, so that's fine. I mentioned that off the top because a story from the Canadian press caught my attention. And in the story, one of the panelists from yesterday's panels, Carmen Gill, a UNB professor, sociology professor, spoke to the Canadian press about the notion of criminalizing coercive control. Of course, that was discussed at length yesterday in the afternoon panel. But no connection was made to Miss Banfield or the events of the mass casualty. But in the interview afterwards, Miss Gill mentioned, yes, that Miss Banfield was certainly the victim of coercive control. So just interesting dynamic. I thought that, during the proceedings themselves, there can be nothing said or any connection made between their expertise and the events. But as soon as that's done afterwards in interviews, people are making those fairly clear connections in some cases, like the coercive control discussion. So that was just a point I see in reading some of the news reports coming out of yesterday. Not a great deal of coverage of today's panel, not a great deal of live coverage of any of these panels, which again, I think somewhat feeds into the Mass Casualty Commission's goal of, I think, having fewer people paying attention to what's exactly going on. Today there was, by the way, it's 30 degrees and sunny outside here in July in Nova Scotia, so very few people would be paying attention as well. It looked to me, I was watching the live stream, that the room where the proceedings were taking place was fairly empty. Be curious to see from anybody inside whether that was the case. None of the reporters that have been covering the mass casualty really were doing any live tweeting today, so I didn't get that sense from inside the room from them. So in the discussion today, which went from about 9:30 until just after 1 p.m., a little break for just a little mid-morning break, were Pamela Cross, who is the legal director of Luke's Place Support and Resource Center in the Durham region, which is just east of Toronto. Dr. Deborah Doherty, who is the former executive director of the Public Legal Education Information Service of New Brunswick. Emma Halpern, who is the executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Society in Nova Scotia, does great work there. Emma was, I think she was a year ahead of me at law school. Anyway, we overlapped during our years there at Dal. Professor Janet Mosher from Osgoode Law School in Toronto. Lorraine Whitman, the president of the Native Women's Association of Canada. And Dr. Rachel Zellars, who is an associate professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and also actually a board member along with me of Engage Nova Scotia. Actually haven't had the pleasure yet of meeting Dr. Zellars in person. We've had some Zoom meetings together, board meetings together through Engage, but haven't met her yet face to face. Okay, so I'll go through some of what was discussed today. A lot of it was repeating, and actually the panelists themselves were sort of acknowledging that some of what they were discussing was repeating things that were covered in earlier panel discussions. But if you want to know really the tone of and the content of what took place, there was two things that happened before, or that I noticed happening before the conversations really got started, that sort of give us all a sense of what was going to take place. One was Ms. Whitman, the president of the Native Women's Association of Canada, started off with a blessing before the panel started. Now, you'll know if you've been watching the Mass Casualty Commission that they start every day off with the sort of standard brief land acknowledgement. But Ms. Whitman also, in addition to that, requested and was given permission, presumably, I guess, to do a blessing before the panel discussion started. Everybody stood up like we were in church and listened along with her as she did this sort of blessing or spiritual wish that the discussion would go well and bear fruit and do all those good things. So that was one thing. You don't really see this in court. I mean, if this was a formal religious prayer of some sort, I think it would be certainly frowned upon. You don't see that in court, any kind of judicial proceeding, but that was requested and permitted this morning. The other thing was Miss Cross, Pamela Cross from the Luke's Place Support and Resource Center in Ontario. I noticed her laptop was showing very prominently on the screen, and on the back of the laptop was a big sticker for Thelma and Louise Live, which I looked up as a live version play of the 1991 movie. Excellent movie. Susan Sarandon, Gina Davis, Brad Pitt, all those things. So if anybody's not familiar with that movie, won some Oscars, it was nominated at least. Both Thelma and Louise at different times were the victims of rape, and there was some murders. I don't want to give away anything, but that was the theme of that movie, and trying to emerge from those difficult circumstances. So that was on display with Miss Cross's laptop. So I thought that was kind of curious. Okay, so the discussions topics included such things as the difficulty with women, black women in Canada, with the racial history of slavery and how women were brought in, and all those things that were makes it difficult for them. For some women, the precarious immigration status that they have makes them much more dependent on their spouse, who's potentially a sponsor, could potentially withdraw that sponsorship and put their immigration status in doubt. Drug addicts would have difficulty with child welfare services in any kind of a breakup. Sex workers, same kind of a story. Long discussion on women in a rural context having difficulty. So, and I understand this too. You get, used to worry about people coming to my office, the law office, and parking there, and like, well, somebody drives by, they're going to recognize the vehicle, and sometimes people would take other means to get there or park a little further away, depending on the circumstances. But if you park there and, your neighbor, your mother-in-law drives by, sees your vehicle there, oh, what were you doing at the law office? Or if you make a report to the police, well, that police officer might be in your church or community group that you're in. Your spouse might be the coach of a local team or some community leader, or have connections, all that sort of thing. So that's all true. Another issue that was brought up was issues around child custody. If a woman leaves a difficult relationship, abusive relationship, and goes into a living situation that isn't stable or isn't, doesn't have enough bedrooms and all those things, well, then all of a sudden, as between the two spouses, the child custody family court, might come down on the side of the more stable situation, and thus the victim of abuse could lose custody of children just by making a report. So some interesting discussions there. I think more than one of them, experts noted that, sometimes it's the worst advice to give, but the accurate, terrible to say, but sometimes the safest thing to do for women in these difficult circumstances is to stay in them rather than leave and put themselves at even greater risk, put their children at risk, all of those cascading effects. So that was so those were all interesting. Emotional at times. I mean, there were some stories being told, examples being given of other situations that these women were dealing with, clients of theirs were dealing with. So, the discussion, or the panelists at least, were getting emotional, and the other panelists with us were also getting emotional and listening to people sort of a lot of hushed tones, respectful reactions, all those things that you might expect from the kind of a weighty discussion. But there was no real attempt to connect this expertise or these situations to the events of the Mass Casualty Commission. I've said this before, and I don't want to keep repeating points that I've made in other videos, but here we have these experts, and no attempt made to connect their expertise, their fields of study, to the situation being faced by Miss Banfield. Miss Banfield, who wasn't living in a rural area, the cottage was in a rural area, but she was living in Dartmouth, who had supportive family members who could to whom she could have gone to stay. I believe she's staying with her sister now, who had access to at least one vehicle, who had probably, it sounds like potential access. Whitman wouldn't have been too happy about it probably, but to tens of thousands of dollars in cash hidden around the house, in Dartmouth, in Portapique. So had in that sense an ability to protect herself, at least to some extent. So not really in the same circumstances as are being described by the panelists, or that were being described by the panelists today. So I would have liked to have seen more of a discussion on those, whether it's her specific circumstances or circumstances more in line with hers, rather than these very much marginalized women that were sort of the focus of today's discussion. Okay, so that's the specifics. Stepping back for a second, I mean, like I said, this is the eighth session panel discussion, expert witness panel of discussion of domestic violence, intimate partner violence, gender-based violence. That would seem to imply that the Mass Casualty Commission has determined that this is the most important causal element of the events of the mass casualty. That's one thing, and that this is the area, that this is the area where the most meaningful change might potentially occur. Neither of those two conclusions are obvious to me, having watched the proceedings to date. I think it's still an open question. Did domestic violence, did Miss Banfield, his feelings towards Miss Banfield, his abusive conduct towards her prompt Gabriel Whitman to burn down his own buildings, his own cottage, warehouse, and then go on to kill 22 other people? That's not obvious. We've heard about property disputes. We've heard about his COVID-19 concerns. We've heard about, potentially complex relationship with the RCMP and the police generally. All of those issues have received really comparatively little attention from the Mass Casualty Commission, compared to domestic violence and related issues. So it seems as though the commissioners have made that determination in advance that is the most important causal element of all of this. So I think that's a premature conclusion. And if it is a conclusion, they haven't actually stated that it is a conclusion yet. So some issues there. Tomorrow, so that's all I wanted to say about today's proceedings. Tomorrow, if anybody is going to be watching on a sunny Friday in July with 30-degree weather, there's two experts that are going to be presenting on forensic psychological assessments. Now, they are not presenting a forensic psychological assessment of Gabriel Whitman. Rather, they are going to talk about the concept and the current sort of science around these assessments and tell us how accurate any assessment of Gabriel Whitman may have been, could have been. hold out a sliver of hope that they'll actually talk about him in the reports that are published on the Commission website. I don't think the word Whitman is used. There doesn't seem to be any reference to him directly, although they seem to be studying, if I'm reading these correctly, they seem to be studying a forensic psychological assessment that was done of Whitman, and they're going to come in now and tell us whether that study was accurate or helpful. So we'll see. We'll see what that says, what they say about all that tomorrow when they come in to testify, and I will be watching it, and I will report back to you after that all takes place. So thanks for watching, thanks for listening today, and we'll see you next time.